The shocking truth. Who really destroyed the Beatles? New York City, 1970. The greatest band in the history of music was gone, and the world needed someone to blame. It always does. The newspapers pointed their fingers. The lawyers built their cases. The fans chose their villains. But what if everything the world believed about the destruction of the Beatles was wrong? What if the real truth, the one buried beneath a decade of competing narratives and carefully managed reputations, was darker, more human, and infinitely more disturbing than anything anyone had been willing to say out loud? The year is 1970. New York City, that relentless machine of ambition and reinvention, was the backdrop for the official ending of the most extraordinary creative partnership the 20th century had produced. The legal documents were being filed. The press statements were being drafted. The world was absorbing, with a mixture of shock and grief and the particular, helpless anger of people who have just been told that something they loved is gone and will not be coming back. The story the world received was clean. Too clean. It had villains and victims, causes and effects, a timeline that moved from the death of Brian Epstein in 1967, that crucial, irreplaceable human anchor, through the chaotic disaster of the Magical Mystery Tour, through the White Album sessions and their documented tensions, through the Get Back rehearsals and their camera-recorded dysfunction, to the final, legal dissolution in 1970. It was a story with identifiable turning points and assignable blame. Yoko Ono was the most common villain in the popular version, the woman who came between John and the band, who inserted herself into the creative process, whose presence in the studio the others found intrusive and destabilizing. Linda Eastman, who became Linda McCartney, was the secondary figure, the woman whose family's legal representation Paul had insisted upon, fracturing the band's management along lines that proved impossible to bridge. Alan Klein, the New York music business operator who had inserted himself into the band's affairs with the aggressive confidence of a man who understood money better than he understood art, was the structural villain, the figure whose presence in the band's business affairs had irrevocably aligned John, George, and Ringo against Paul and set in motion the legal machinery that would grind the dream into dust. These were the official suspects, and they were all, in their various ways, real contributors to what happened. But none of them, not Yoko, not Linda, not Klein, not any individual person or decision or moment, was the true answer to the question that the world had been asking ever since that April morning in 1970 when Paul McCartney announced he was leaving. The true answer was something older, deeper, and far more difficult to assign to a single cause. It was something that had been growing in the dark for years before any of the official villains arrived on the scene. Something that the four young men from Liverpool had never found a way to address, because addressing it would have required a kind of honesty that the structure of their band, the hierarchy, the creative competition, the carefully maintained roles, had never quite allowed. This is the story of what that something was, and why the world has spent 50 years looking for the wrong answer. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. To understand what really destroyed the Beatles, you have to go back to before the destroying began. You have to go back to the beginning, to Liverpool, to Hamburg, to the specific, unrepeatable circumstances that created not just a band but a world unto itself. For young men, bound together by music and ambition and the particular intimacy of shared poverty, shared struggle, and shared discovery. They had built something together that none of them could have built alone, and they all knew it. That knowledge, the knowledge of mutual dependence, of creative interdependence so complete that the individual and the collective had become genuinely inseparable, was the foundation of everything. It was also, ultimately, the source of everything that went wrong. John Lennon, the architect, the original visionary, the one whose artistic instinct had shaped the band's identity from the beginning. A man of brilliant, restless intelligence who needed, simultaneously, to be the most important person in every room and to be genuinely loved by the people in that room. These two needs were, in the long run, incompatible. Fame satisfied the first at the expense of the second, producing in John a loneliness that grew in direct proportion to his public success. Paul McCartney, the melodic genius, the diplomat, the man whose extraordinary gift for melody was matched by an equally extraordinary need for control, a need that had its roots not in ego, though ego was certainly present, but in a deep, genuine terror of chaos, of things falling apart, of the beautiful thing being lost through insufficient attention and effort. Paul was the one who kept showing up, kept trying, kept pushing, and in doing so, kept inadvertently communicating to the others that their efforts were insufficient, their commitment inadequate, their vision less clear than his. George Harrison, the spiritual architect, the most consistently underestimated member of a band that had spent a decade underestimating him. George had been absorbing the inequity of the band's creative hierarchy for years, the rationed songs, the overruled ideas, the subtle, unspoken but unmistakable message that his contributions were supplementary rather than essential. He had transformed this experience, through discipline and spiritual practice, into something that made him, by the late 1960s, arguably the deepest and most fully realized artist in the band. But the transformation had cost him something. It had cost him a certain willingness to fight for his place, a willingness that had been worn away by years of being told, implicitly, that his place was smaller than he deserved. Ringo Starr, the heartbeat, the most loved, the least complicated, the one whose fundamental decency and professional steadiness had been the band's emotional ballast through every storm. Ringo had never sought the spotlight or competed for creative dominance. He had simply shown up and played, with a warmth and a reliability that the others took for granted so consistently and so completely that the taking for granted had itself become a problem. The problem of a man whose contributions to the whole were so seamlessly integrated that they were invisible, and whose invisibility had gradually, painfully, made him feel that the band could function without him. It had led him to walk out, briefly, during the White Album sessions. That walkout, quiet, unspectacular, entirely characteristic of a man who absorbed rather than exploded, was one of the most significant events in the band's decline and one of the least examined. These were the four people, and what had happened to them, by 1969, was not primarily the fault of the people who had entered their orbit. It was the fault of what they had become, what fame had made of them. What a decade of unprecedented, world-altering success had done to four young men who had never been prepared for it, who had never had the tools to navigate it, and who had been required to do so anyway, in real time, in public, under the observation of the entire world. The official narrative of the Beatles' dissolution has a timeline. Brian Epstein dies in August 1967. The Magical Mystery Tour is a creative and critical stumble. The White Album sessions are documented chaos. And so on, through the Get Back rehearsals and the rooftop concert and the Abbey Road recordings and finally, the legal ending of 1970. But the first fracture, the original wound from which everything else eventually bled, predates all of this. It predates Brian Epstein's death, predates the Maharishi period, predates almost everything in the official account. It happened in 1966, on a hot August evening in San Francisco at Candlestick Park, during what would turn out to be the last concert the Beatles ever performed for a paying audience. They knew it was the last one. That much is documented. John had brought a camera and was photographing the audience, a private act of preservation by a man who understood, in real time, that something was ending. The shows had become impossible. The screaming had made the music literally inaudible. They had been touring continuously for 4 years, performing in a bubble of sound so overwhelming that none of them could hear themselves play, under security conditions that had transformed what had once been joyful into something closer to controlled imprisonment. They stopped touring. The official reason given was practical: the impossibility of replicating their studio work in a live setting, the logistical complexity of large-scale touring, the safety concerns that had become increasingly real as Beatlemania escalated towards something that occasionally tipped into genuine danger. All of these reasons were true, but something else was also true, and it was something that none of them spoke about publicly at the time, and that the official histories have consistently underweight. When the Beatles stopped touring, They lost the thing that had held them together through everything else. The stage. The nightly act of standing together in front of an audience and making music together. The shared purpose, the shared adrenaline, the shared vulnerability of live performance that had been, from the very beginning, the foundation on which everything else was built. In the studio, they were four individuals with competing creative visions, competing egos, competing needs. On the stage, they were a band, a single organism, functioning as one. And when the stage was removed, when they moved permanently into the studio, that space of infinite perfectibility and infinite opportunity for creative conflict, they lost the one context in which their differences were subordinated to a shared, immediate purpose. This is the fracture that nobody talks about. Not the management disputes, not the personal relationships, not the legal battles. The loss of the stage. The loss of the nightly, irreplaceable experience of four people who needed each other completely, in real time, for something that none of them could do alone. Everything else that followed, every conflict, every misalignment, every accumulated grievance, was, in some essential way, a consequence of that loss. A wound that no amount of studio brilliance, no matter how extraordinary, could entirely heal. Understanding what really destroyed the Beatles requires understanding how the small things work, how they accumulate, how a series of individually survivable moments can combine, over time, into something that is no longer survivable at all. The creative inequality was real, and it had been real from the beginning. John and Paul wrote the songs. George's contributions were rationed. Ringo's creative voice was barely consulted. This was not, in the early years, experienced as injustice. It was simply the organic hierarchy of a band whose two primary songwriters happened to be among the most gifted of their generation. But as the band matured, as George's writing deepened and Ringo's musical sensibility developed, the hierarchy became increasingly difficult to justify and increasingly corrosive to the people it disadvantaged. George submitted songs for albums. Songs that were returned with the polite, efficient dismissal of people who have not fully listened. Songs that eventually appeared, unmodified and fully formed, on the triple album that followed the band's dissolution and immediately demonstrated to the world that George Harrison had been carrying enough unreleased material to fill 3 albums, while John and Paul debated which of their own songs to include. The humiliation of that discovery, the retroactive proof of exactly how much had been suppressed and how good it was, is something that George's biographers have addressed and that the wider cultural conversation has consistently underprocessed. Ringo walked out during the White Album sessions. He did not make a scene. He did not issue a statement. He simply, quietly left, because the atmosphere in the studio had become so tense, so focused on the individual rather than the collective, that he no longer felt like a member of the band he was ostensibly recording with. He felt like a session musician. He went home, sat in his garden, and waited. The others sent him flowers and a note asking him to come back. He came back. The incident was smoothed over, absorbed into the ongoing chaos of the sessions, treated as a temporary disruption rather than a diagnostic symptom of something structural. It was a symptom of something structural, and treating it as a temporary disruption rather than a structural diagnosis was itself part of the problem. The band's consistent, understandable, ultimately fatal tendency to manage its crises in the short term rather than address their underlying causes. The business decisions accumulated alongside the personal ones. The death of Brian Epstein in 1967 removed the one person who had been capable of holding the band's business affairs in a framework of personal loyalty and mutual respect. Whatever Brian's shortcomings as a business manager, and they were real, the financial arrangements he had negotiated were frequently disadvantageous to the band. He had been irreplaceable in a way that none of his successors understood or could replicate. He had been, in the fullest sense, their advocate, the person who cared about them first and the business second. What replaced him was the opposite. Alan Klein cared about the business first and about the band only insofar as the band was the business. He was effective, in his way. He recovered money that had been lost, renegotiated deals that had been disadvantageous, reorganized Apple Corps with a ruthless efficiency that the band's own chaotic management of it had made desperately necessary. But he was also a man whose presence in the band's affairs created exactly the kind of adversarial atmosphere that the band, already fracturing along personal fault lines, was least equipped to navigate. Paul's insistence on Lee Eastman was not, as it was publicly characterized, simply nepotism or stubbornness. It was the recognition, accurate, as it turned out, that Klein was not to be trusted, that his interests and the band's interests were not identical, that the efficient management of a financial empire was not the same thing as the preservation of a creative partnership. Paul was right about Klein. He was also, in his insistence, deeply counterproductive. The manner of his opposition, the way it positioned him against the other three, the way it allowed the Klein situation to become a proxy for every other tension that had been building, was the kind of being right in a way that makes everything worse. By 1969, the small things had become very large. The rationed songs, the walked-out drummer, the dead manager, the disputed management, the absent stage, the competing legal representations, all of it had accumulated into a weight that pressed down on every creative session, every business meeting, every attempt to be in the same room and make something together. It pressed down on the music. It pressed down on the friendships. And eventually, it pressed down on the will to continue. The world has always pointed to specific moments as the true ending. The Get Back sessions. Paul's announcement in April 1970. The filing of legal proceedings. But the real moment of no return, the moment when the destruction became irreversible, was not any of these. It was quieter, less dramatic, and more devastating than anything that made the official record. It happened in a recording studio in London during the Abbey Road sessions in the summer of 1969. The album that would become Abbey Road was, by every external measure, a triumph. One of the greatest records they had ever made, perhaps the greatest. The production was meticulous. The songs were extraordinary. The medley on side 2, that long, interlocking sequence of song fragments woven together with a structural sophistication that Paul had conceived and that the others had executed with the commitment of people who understood they were making something genuinely remarkable, was a creative achievement of the highest order. But something was happening in the spaces between the sessions. In the corridors, in the dressing rooms, in the parking lot, in the silences between takes and the conversations that happened and the conversations that didn't. Something that the music itself, however extraordinary, could not entirely conceal. John was not there for significant portions of the sessions. A serious car accident had hospitalized him, had hospitalized Yoko and his son Julian and her daughter Kyoko, and the recovery was slow and painful. When he was present, his participation carried the quality of a man who is giving what he can and who knows, though he cannot yet say it publicly, that what he can give to this particular endeavor is approaching its limit. George had a song he wanted to include, something. A song that would be called the greatest love song of its century, that Frank Sinatra would record, that generations of listeners would respond to with the helpless recognition that genuine art always produces. George presented it to the band with the careful, measured confidence of a man who knows what he has made. John listened. Paul listened. It was included. But the manner of its inclusion, the slight, almost imperceptible quality of surprise that accompanied the acknowledgement of its greatness, the way it was received as an exception rather than as confirmation of what George had always been capable of, told George everything he needed to know about how his contributions were still being understood. After everything, after all the years, after all the songs he had written that had not been heard, he was still, in the operative psychology of the band, the junior partner whose excellence was a pleasant surprise rather than a given. He absorbed this, as he had absorbed everything, and the absorbing was nearly complete. Paul was pouring everything he had into the album with the focused, desperate energy of a man who understands, on some level, that this is the last chance. The medley was his idea, his structure, his insistence that the fragments they had accumulated could be shaped into something unified and transcendent. He was right. It was. But the energy with which he pursued it, the relentless, controlling precision that had always been simultaneously his greatest creative asset and his most damaging interpersonal tendency, had, by this point, so thoroughly exhausted the other's goodwill that his rightness about the music no longer had the power to overcome their weariness with the experience of making it with him. Ringo played everything asked of him. He always did. His drum part on the end, the song that closes the medley, the one with the rare, precious Ringo drum solo that he had always been too modest to request, and that his bandmates had finally, in this final act, chosen to give him, was one of the finest moments of his career. He played it with the quiet, committed excellence of a man who loves his work and does not need the work to love him back. The sessions ended. The album was completed. It was, by every measure, extraordinary. And the people who had made it went their separate ways with the particular, exhausted relief of people who have just done something genuinely difficult and who are not certain they have the capacity to do it again. They did not do it again. Abbey Road was the last album the Beatles completed together. Let It Be, though it was released later, had been recorded earlier. It was the document of the dissolution rather than a product of the band in any functioning sense. Abbey Road was the ending. And the ending was, like all the best Beatles work, simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking. A masterpiece made by four people who could no longer bear to be in the same room, who somehow, through the sheer force of their talent and their shared history, made something together that sounded like love. That is the real climax. Not a fight, not a document, not a press release. The making of something beautiful by people who were already gone from each other. The proof that the music had outlasted the band. And the devastating question that this fact raises. If the music could still be this good, if the creative capacity was still this extraordinary, what exactly was it that made continuing impossible? The answer is the thing this story has been building toward. The answer is grief. Grief. That is the word. The one that the official narrative of the Beatles' dissolution has consistently avoided, because grief is harder to assign and harder to argue about in courtrooms than management disputes and creative differences. But grief is what destroyed the Beatles. Not grief for Brian Epstein, though that grief was real and significant and more consequential than it has ever been fully acknowledged. Brian's death had removed the one person who had loved them and managed them simultaneously, who had understood that those two things, the loving and the managing, were not separable, that you could not effectively represent artists of their particular sensitivity and complexity without caring about them as people first. His absence had left a void that no amount of business efficiency could fill. Not grief for the innocence of the early years, though that grief was also real. The grief of four young men who had stood on the stage at Candlestick Park in 1966 and understood, without being able to say it to each other, that something they had loved was already over, that the band they had built from nothing in Liverpool and Hamburg was already something different, already something that the world owned more than they did. The grief that destroyed the Beatles was the grief of unspoken things. The accumulated weight of feelings that had never been expressed, of needs that had never been acknowledged, of truths that had never been said. The grief of a creative partnership that had never developed the emotional language necessary to sustain itself through the pressures that were applied to it. John had never been able to tell the others what he needed from them. He had never found a way to say, without the armor of wit and detachment that had always protected him, I am lonely in this. I need you to see me. Not the Beatle. Me. The capacity for that kind of honesty, the kind that makes a partnership durable, had always been present in John, as his music demonstrated repeatedly, but it had been inaccessible within the specific dynamics of the band. And by the time Yoko provided him with a relationship in which that honesty was possible, the band had already been deprived of it for too long. Paul had never been able to admit his fear. The controlling, the directing, the relentless pushing toward the perfect version of the music, none of it had ever been acknowledged for what it actually was. The behavior of a man who was terrified that if he stopped pushing, the thing he loved most would fall apart. Paul's management of the band in its final years was the management of a person operating from fear rather than confidence. And fear-based management, however skilled and however well-intentioned, produces exactly the resentment it is trying to prevent. George had never been able to say what his decade of suppression had cost him. He had absorbed it and transformed it and made extraordinary music from it. But he had never said to John and Paul, simply and directly, what you have done to me in this band has hurt me. The spiritual framework he had built around the experience was genuine, but it was also, in part, a way of not having to have that conversation. And the conversation, not had for 10 years, had become a wall between them that was now too high to climb. Ringo had never been able to say that he had felt invisible. The most beloved Beatle, the one whose warmth and humor and fundamental decency were universally appreciated, had never been able to articulate the quiet, grinding loneliness of being the fourth one, the one whose contributions were taken for granted, the one who was loved generically rather than specifically, for his role rather than for himself. His walkout during the White Album sessions was the closest he had ever come to saying it, and it had not been heard. These unspoken things, John's loneliness, Paul's fear, George's suppressed wound, Ringo's invisible loneliness, were the real destroyers. They were the things that management disputes and legal battles and outside influences had found purchase in, the cracks in the foundation that every external pressure had been able to exploit. Remove Yoko and Klein and the Eastmans, and the cracks would still have been there, would still have been widening, would still have been waiting for the moment when the pressure exceeded the structure's capacity to hold. The Beatles were not destroyed by any individual person or decision or external force. They were destroyed by the absence of a conversation that was always possible and never had. The conversation about what they needed from each other, about what the band had cost them individually, about what love, the real kind, the durable kind, the kind that survives difficulty because it has been built from honesty rather than performance, actually required. New York City, 1970. The legal documents were filed. The dream was officially, formally, irrevocably over. And the world, needing its villains and its explanations, constructed the story it needed, clean, assignable, satisfying in the way that simple stories are satisfying. Yoko, Klein, Linda, Paul, John, take your pick. The story had enough named causes to accommodate almost any preferred version of events. But the truth sat quietly beneath all of it. The truth that the four young men from Liverpool, who had built something together that the world had never seen and would not see again, had never quite learned to say to each other the things that would have made the keeping of it possible. John Lennon died on December 8, 1980, on the pavement outside the Dakota Building in New York City. He was 40 years old. In the months before his death, he and Paul had been speaking on the phone with a new warmth, a new ease, the careful rebuilding of a connection that had survived everything the decade had thrown at it. The conversations were cautious and genuine and full of the ghost of everything that had not been said during the years of estrangement. They were, by all accounts, the beginning of something, a slow, imperfect, deeply human reconciliation between two people who had loved each other in the complicated, irreplaceable way of people who have shared something that no one else on earth can fully understand. John died before the reconciliation was complete, before the things that needed to be said were said. The letter he wrote to Paul in the early hours of December 1980, found in a drawer of his desk, folded and unfinished and never sent, ended mid-sentence. The thought incomplete, the page still holding the white space of everything that had not yet been said. Paul McCartney has spent the decades since carrying the weight of that incompleteness. He has spoken about John with a consistency and a tenderness that is its own kind of conversation, the continuing of a dialogue that was interrupted in the language they had always shared. He has written songs addressed to John. He has told stories about him. He has kept the connection alive in the only way available to a person whose other person is gone. George Harrison died in November 2001 of cancer, 21 years after John. He died at Paul McCartney's house in Los Angeles, surrounded by people who loved him, having made his peace with the life he had lived and the music he had made, and the extraordinary, complicated, irreplaceable experience of having been one of four young men from Liverpool who had remade the world. His final album, Brainwashed, completed by his son Donnie, contained songs that were as beautiful and as spiritually generous as anything he had ever written. He had lost none of it. He had carried all of it, the talent and the wound, and the hard-won peace of a man who had outlasted his own suffering. Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney are still alive, still making music, still carrying between them the last living memory of what it was to be there. In the rehearsal rooms of Liverpool and the clubs of Hamburg and the studios of Abbey Road and the stages of every city in the world that had loved them. They speak of John and George with the particular, careful tenderness of survivors who understand the weight of what they are holding. The question of who destroyed the Beatles has been answered 1,000 times, in 1,000 different ways, by historians and biographers and fans and the participants themselves. Every answer contains some truth. None of them contains the whole truth. The whole truth is this: the Beatles were four extraordinary human beings who found each other at the right moment and made something together that exceeded what any of them could have imagined alone. And they were destroyed not by any villain or any decision or any external force, but by the ordinary, universal, devastating human failure to say the true thing to the people who most needed to hear it. To say, I need you. To say, you have hurt me. To say, I am afraid. To say, you are more important to me than my pride. They made the music of those things. They sang about need and loss and love and fear with a directness and a beauty that has never been surpassed. But they could not always say those things to each other, in the rooms where the band lived, in the ordinary language of four people who needed each other and did not always know how to show it. The music played on. It plays still. And in the playing, something of what was never said between them is said anyway, imperfectly, indirectly, in the language of melody and lyric that was always, for all four of them, the truest language they possessed. New York City breathes. The world turns. The music plays. And the echo remains, quiet and permanent and real. What if the most shocking truth about who destroyed the Beatles is not a name, not a person, not a decision, not an outside force, but a silence? The silence of four young men who loved each other more than they could say, and who paid for that silence with the greatest creative partnership the world had ever seen.